My family gave my brother the empire, not quietly, not privately. They handed it to him under crystal chandeliers, with champagne glasses raised, and 150 witnesses applauding. What they didn't know was that I still had the final vote. My name is Daniel Crawford. I'm 29 years old. For most of my life, I was introduced the same way. This is Daniel. He's the thoughtful one, not the strategist, not the visionary, not the future of Crawford infrastructure, just thoughtful. In our family, that was another word for replaceable. Crawford infrastructure isn't small. We build highways across Texas, government bridges, commercial developments, valued at just over $110 million last year. My father, Richard Crawford, built it from nothing. He tells that story every chance he gets. How he slept in his truck at 27. How he negotiated contracts with men twice his age. How weakness never paid the bills. He built a company on dominance. And he built a family the same way. When I was 14, Marcus negotiated the price of a used pickup truck down by $3,000. My father told that story for years. When I was 14, I convinced a subcontractor not to quit after my dad yelled at him. That story was never told. Marcus learned how to win. I learned how to keep people. In my father's world, only one of those mattered. The ballroom was gold and glass, live jazz, state senators shaking hands with private equity partners, a 12-foot LED screen behind the stage, looping a highlight reel titled The Crawford Legacy. Not the Crawford family, the Crawford legacy. Marcus stood on my father's right, tailored navy suit, confident smile. The kind of man investors feel safe betting on. I stood on his left, same last name, different future. When my father took the microphone, I knew this wasn't just a birthday speech. He never gathered this many powerful people without a reason. I've spent 35 years building something that will outlive me. Applause. I've made hard decisions. I've made unpopular decisions. But I've never made weak ones. He let that line hang. Then he motioned Marcus forward. My son Marcus understands what it takes to lead. Standing ovation. And then came the line that changed everything. To ensure stability, I've amended my will. There will be no divided control. A murmur. Marcus will inherit full controlling shares of Crawford infrastructure. Full control. Not majority, not shared. Full. And Daniel, he smiled, that rehearsed public relations smile. Daniel has a good heart. A few people laughed lightly, safe laughter. But leadership isn't about being liked. It's about being strong. Pause. Daniel isn't built for war. The room didn't gasp. They nodded. Because in that world, softness is weakness. And weakness doesn't inherit empires. They expected anger, embarrassment, maybe even a scene. Instead, I nodded. I understand. My father relaxed. Marcus squeezed his shoulder. The investors smiled. Crisis avoided. The soft son accepted his place. But here's what none of them knew. 20 years ago, when Crawford infrastructure was still fragile, my father didn't own full control. He never truly did. There was another signature on the original formation documents, another controlling clause. And that clause had never been erased. It had only been forgotten by everyone except the one man my father pushed out. And that man had taught me something Marcus never learned. Power isn't who stands on stage. Power is who gets counted in the vote. My father always tells a clean version of the company's history. He was the risk taker. He was the negotiator. He was the one who carried everything on his back. But he didn't start Crawford Infrastructure alone. He just made sure people forgot that. When I was 23, I was digging through archived documents for a government compliance audit. That's when I saw it, the original formation papers. There were 2 signatures at the bottom, Richard Crawford and Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale wasn't an employee. He was a co-founder. He initially owned 38% of the company. I asked legal about him. They gave me a short answer. He exited years ago. No explanation, no context, just erased. 2 years later, at a construction conference in Austin, a man with silver hair stopped me near the coffee station. "You're Richard's younger son, aren't you?" I nodded. "Daniel." He extended his hand. "Thomas Hale." He didn't look bitter. He didn't look angry, just observant. "I assume your father still tells the story like he built it alone." I didn't answer. He smiled slightly. "I thought so." Over the next few months, we met quietly a handful of times. Not in offices, not anywhere public enough to raise questions. Small cafes, quiet corners. Hale told me about the year the company almost collapsed. Cash flow was negative. 2 major projects were behind schedule. The bank was threatening to freeze their line of credit. Hale proposed retaining key engineers, slowing expansion, restructuring contracts carefully. My father proposed cutting 30% of the workforce, selling non-core assets immediately, forcing renegotiations through legal pressure. 2 philosophies, 2 leadership styles. The board was split. And then my father triggered a clause most people barely noticed when they signed the original agreement. Buried in the shareholder agreement was a provision. If a founding partner refused to approve a liquidity protection strategy during financial distress, their shares could be forcibly bought back at an internally agreed valuation. That internal valuation had been set 5 years earlier, when the company was still small. Hale refused to approve mass layoffs. My father activated the clause. Hale was forced to sell his 38% stake at a price that undervalued the company by nearly 5 times its real potential. 6 months later, Crawford Infrastructure secured an $80 million state contract. The company's value quadrupled. Hale was gone by then. I was 10 years old when that contract was signed. Marcus was 12. We didn't understand what was happening behind closed doors. But I remember something clearly. That night, my father said to my mother, "Now I finally have full control. Not we, not the company. I." During one of our later meetings, Hale asked me a simple question. "Have you ever read the original founding agreement in full?" I thought I had. I'd been working inside the company since I was 22. I understood operations, contracts, margins, but I had never read the appendix closely. That's where it was. An addendum attached to the founding agreement stated, if full controlling interest of the company were ever transferred to a single individual, without the consent of both original founders, the remaining founder retained a special voting right in any restructuring of ownership control. My father bought Hale's shares, but he never eliminated his status as co-founder, and that status carried something shares did not: a vote. A vote that could only be activated during a total control transfer, like granting 100% controlling shares to one heir. Marcus always believed power was percentage. ownership charts, equity structures, voting blocks. But he had never read the original documents. He had only seen the revised versions my father circulated internally. Hale once told me, "Your father is brilliant. He understands leverage, but he assumes no one else will take the time to read the fine print." Then he looked at me carefully. "You would." Hale never asked me to overthrow anyone. He never offered to restore his shares. He only said this: "If one day control is abused again, I won't vote for the man who repeats history." I asked him, "And who would you vote for?" He didn't hesitate. "For the one who understands that a company isn't a battlefield." So when my father stood under those chandeliers and handed the empire entirely to Marcus, he believed he had secured everything. But in reality, he had just triggered the very clause he thought he buried 20 years ago. After the night at River Oaks, nothing changed publicly, but everything shifted privately. No announcement, no memo, just subtle doors closing. Emails that used to come automatically stopped appearing in my inbox. Strategy meetings were rescheduled. Access permissions were quietly adjusted. No one fired me. They just started shrinking my oxygen. And that's how you remove someone without ever saying it out loud. A week later, I found out the federal highway bid meeting had taken place without me. I had negotiated that project for 6 months. I walked straight into Marcus's office. "Why wasn't I in that room?" He didn't look up from his laptop. "You're not overseeing that division anymore." "Since when?" "Since we restructured." "I'm still COO." He finally leaned back. "Not permanently." It wasn't a threat. It was a timeline. 2 days later, my father held a private session with 3 board members. I wasn't invited, but one of them called me afterward. "Richard's trying to amend the bylaws," he said quietly, "to limit who can call an emergency board session." I understood immediately. He didn't want me invoking the founding clause before the will became operational. "How many support him?" I asked. "He still has influence, but some of us are uncomfortable with the public transfer announcement." Uncomfortable. That wasn't rebellion, but it wasn't blind loyalty either. 3 days after the birthday announcement, a minority investment fund sent a formal inquiry. They wanted clarification on the succession structure. They didn't want their stake dependent entirely on one heir who had never held CEO authority. Marcus dismissed it. "It's a small fund." It wasn't. When investors ask questions, board members start calculating risk. And when risk enters the room, control starts to loosen. Marcus found me in the parking garage that evening. "You're creating instability. I'm requesting transparency. Dad made the decision. I'm talking about the board." He stepped closer. "You think Hale can save you? I don't need saving. You don't have the votes." I held his gaze. "Are you sure?" He smirked. "You don't control the shares." "I don't need to." That was the first moment he hesitated. I called Hale that night. "He's trying to modify the bylaws before the session." "Have they passed it?" Hale asked. "Not yet." "Then you go first. Call the session now?" "Now." He paused. "Once you trigger this, there's no walking it back." I looked out from my office window. Floor 27, the skyline my father liked to claim he built. "You think I still have a place to walk back to?" Hale didn't answer. He just said, "I'll be there." I reread the founding agreement one more time. Appendix B clause, 7.3. In the event of full transfer of controlling interest. Clear language. No ambiguity. I drafted the email. Subject: Emergency board session. Review of control, transfer legitimacy. I cited the clause. Attached the original scanned document with both signatures and sent it to every board member. 2:13 a.m. No emotion, just documentation. 7:42 a.m. Marcus called. "What the hell are you doing?" "Exercising rights granted under the founding agreement. You're destabilizing the company. I'm requesting a lawful vote. You'll damage the family's reputation. I'm protecting the company's structure." Silence. Then Marcus lowered his voice. "You'll regret this. I already regret 20 years, not today." Over the next 24 hours, 3 board members contacted me privately. One asked about enforceability. One asked what my endgame was. One simply asked, "Does Richard know you've read the appendix?" "No," I said. And that was when I realized something critical. My father's greatest advantage wasn't capital, it was assumption. He assumed no one would ever challenge him. He assumed no one read the fine print. He assumed I was too soft. The emergency session was scheduled for Monday. 9 a.m. boardroom, floor 30. For 20 years, every major decision in that room had passed almost unanimously. This time would be different, because for the first time in 2 decades, Thomas Hale's name would appear again in the official minutes. And when he walked through that door, this wouldn't just be a family succession. It would be a vote about what kind of leadership the company would accept. Monday, 9 a.m., floor 30. The boardroom hadn't changed in 20 years. The same long walnut table, the same black leather chairs, framed photographs of completed highways and bridges lining the walls. But the atmosphere was different, not confident, heavy. Marcus arrived first. Perfect suit, controlled posture, calm expression. He looked like a man attending his own coronation. My father walked in seconds later. He didn't look at me. That was intentional. Board members filtered in quietly. Some nodded at me. Some avoided eye contact. At 8:58 a.m., the doors opened again. Thomas Hale walked in. No announcement, no theatrics, just presence. The corporate secretary read his name for the official minutes. Thomas Hale, co-founder. For the first time in 20 years, that title was spoken aloud inside this room. I saw my father's jaw tighten. "This session was unnecessary," my father began. His voice was steady. "The succession structure has already been decided," I replied evenly. "It was announced. It has not been ratified." A small distinction, a massive implication. Marcus leaned forward. "You're misinterpreting a 20-year-old appendix." I'm quoting it. I slid printed copies across the table. Appendix B, clause 7.3. Paper makes things real. I spoke clearly. In the event of full transfer of controlling interest to a single individual without consent of both original founders, the remaining founder retains a special voting right in any restructuring of ownership control. Silence. My father responded quickly. "Thomas sold his shares." Hale spoke for the first time. "I sold my shares, not my status." Calm, measured. A board member flipped through the documents. "Richard, this clause was never removed." My father's voice sharpened. "It's outdated. It's irrelevant." I met his eyes. If it's irrelevant, why was it never amended? That's when the tone shifted. You don't understand the full context, my father snapped. I understand that the clause is active. You're destabilizing the company. I'm protecting its governance, Marcus cut in. This is a technicality. Hale looked at him directly. No, it's a safeguard. A board member spoke up. We need clarity before transferring full control. My father's hand struck the table, not violently, but loudly enough. There is no transfer to review. I control the majority, I answered immediately. You control a majority, not absolute authority. The room went still. No one had spoken to him like that in years. My father turned fully toward me now. You think you're qualified to run this company? I think the board should decide. You've never led a major acquisition. I retained the engineering division you wanted to cut. Leadership isn't about being liked, and it isn't about eliminating anyone who questions you. Marcus glanced at him. That glance mattered. For the first time, Marcus wasn't sure whether to defend emotion or strategy. Hale slowly stood. Richard, 20 years ago, you told me the company needed one clear leader. He paused. But control is not ownership. Control is trust. No one interrupted. This clause doesn't exist for revenge, Hale continued. It exists to prevent unilateral consolidation without oversight. The word oversight echoed. Oversight means accountability. Accountability means limits. And my father has never liked limits. My father's composure finally cracked. This is absurd, he said, louder now. I built this company. I carried it when no one else would. And now you're questioning my authority? No one answered immediately. That silence was louder than agreement. I spoke carefully. No one is questioning your contribution. I am questioning whether unilateral control transfer aligns with the founding agreement. He stared at me. You've been speaking with him behind my back. Yes, no denial. That honesty hit harder than argument. You're betraying your own family. I'm protecting the structure of the company. His voice rose. You're doing this because you're bitter. I'm doing this because governance matters. That word landed. Governance. Investors understand governance. Board members respect governance. It's harder to dismiss than emotion. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. Richard, whether we like it or not, the clause exists. Another added, if we proceed with a full transfer without review, we expose the company to legal challenge. That was the pivot. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about risk. Risk shifts power faster than rebellion ever could. My father looked around the table. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't receiving automatic nods. He was receiving caution. I spoke again. I'm not requesting removal of anyone today. Every head turned toward me. I'm requesting a formal vote of confidence on the proposed full transfer of controlling interest. No drama, no takeover language, just procedure. The corporate secretary looked toward the chairman. Do we proceed to vote on the motion? The room waited. And for the first time in 2 decades, Richard Crawford did not control the tempo of the room. The corporate secretary adjusted her glasses. We will now proceed with a vote regarding the approval of the full transfer of controlling interest to Marcus Crawford. No one moved. The hum of the air conditioning felt louder than usual. This was no longer symbolic. This would enter the official record. My father stood slowly. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calm, which made him more dangerous. "For 35 years," he began, "I have led this company." His voice was steady. "I carried it through the 2008 financial crisis." A board member shifted slightly. "I negotiated settlements when the state tried to bury us in litigation." Another nodded. "I protected this company when others would have folded." He let that sink in. "And now we're allowing a technical clause written during a different era to destabilize succession." There it was. Stability. Boards fear instability more than anything. Marcus leaned forward. "If this motion fails," he said carefully, "the market will interpret it as internal division." He turned slightly toward the youngest board member. "External shareholders will question continuity." Then he looked at Hale. "With respect, you no longer carry financial exposure here." It was subtle, but it implied Hale had nothing to lose. Hale didn't flinch. "I lost 38% when the company was fragile," he replied evenly. "That was exposure enough." Silence. This time I stood, not aggressive, measured. "My father is right about one thing." Every head turned toward me. "He led this company through storms." I looked at him. "I'm not denying that." Then I faced the room. "But today isn't about history. It's about precedent." I slowed my voice deliberately. "If we allow full controlling interest to transfer without formal board ratification under the founding agreement, then the agreement is ceremonial." I turned toward the senior-most director. "You helped draft that document." He didn't look at me, but his fingers tightened around his pen. The secretary began calling names. "Mr. Harris? Approve. 1-0. Ms. Coleman? Reject. 1-1. Mr. Patel? Approve. 2-1. Ms. Nguyen? Reject. 2-2. No one breathed deeply. No one looked around. By the 8th vote, it stood at 4-4. Marcus's jaw tightened. My father's expression remained controlled. 2 votes remained. One of them was Hale. The other was David Chen. "Mr. Thomas Hale?" The room went completely still. Hale did not look at my father. He did not look at me. Reject. 4-5. The motion was failing. Marcus leaned toward my father slightly, but my father did not react. Not yet. "Mr. Reynolds?" The longtime neutral member. He exhaled slowly. "Approve." 5-5. Now it came down to one man, David Chen, 37 years old, on the board for 4 years, historically aligned with my father. My father looked at him, not threatening, just the familiar look that had shaped decisions for decades. Marcus added quietly, "We need stability." David stared down at the printed appendix. Clause 7.3. He swallowed. No one spoke. I didn't look at him. Because if this was about pressure, I would lose. If this was about principle, I had a chance. "Mr. David Chen?" 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. "I reject." 6-5. There was no sound for 3 full seconds. Then the secretary confirmed. "The motion to approve full transfer of controlling interest to Marcus Crawford does not pass." My father didn't slam the table. He didn't stand. He simply sat there, looking at me. Not with anger, not with disappointment, with realization. Absolute control was gone. Not because I was stronger, but because he assumed no one would challenge him. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I said one sentence. Now we can discuss a balanced leadership structure. No takeover, no humiliation, just governance. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the soft son. I was counted. After the secretary confirmed the 6-5 result, no one stood up. There was no applause, no arguments, just silence. The kind of silence that follows a shift in gravity. My father remained seated at the head of the table. Marcus stared at the voting sheet in front of him. I didn't look at either of them, because if I showed victory, I would lose everything I had just protected. The oldest board member cleared his throat. "Well, Daniel, do you intend to nominate yourself as CEO?" That was the logical next move. Challenge authority, win the vote, take the chair. That's how power usually works. I shook my head. No. The word echoed heavier than any speech I'd given. Marcus looked up. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "I did not call this session to replace anyone," I said calmly. "I called it to prevent a dangerous precedent." I looked around the table. If I take full control today, I become the very thing I just challenged. That shifted the room. This was no longer a succession battle. It was a structural correction. "I have an alternative proposal." I slid a document across the table. Governance reform. Clear. Written. Binding. Any transfer of controlling interest above 51% requires a 70% supermajority vote of the board. No single executive may amend founding agreements unilaterally. Any restructuring of ownership control must undergo dual-stage ratification. Not revenge, not dominance, structure. Accountability built into the system. "So what do you want?" Marcus asked. "Oversight." "You don't trust me?" "I don't trust unchecked power." That distinction mattered. It wasn't personal. It was architectural. He leaned back slowly. That was the first time he realized this wasn't about ego. My father finally spoke. "You think I abused power?" His voice was lower now, not angry, not loud, just stripped of performance. "I think you believed there was only one right way," I answered. "And that way built something powerful." I paused. "But it also built fear." The room didn't move, because everyone in that room had felt that fear at some point. No one had ever said it out loud, until now. The corporate secretary asked, "Shall we proceed with a vote on the proposed governance amendment?" This vote felt different, not emotional, not reactive, measured. The result, 8-3. Even 2 of my father's longtime allies voted in favor. Not because they chose me, because they chose accountability. When the board members left, only 3 of us remained. My father, Marcus, me. No lawyers, no secretary, no audience. Marcus spoke first. "You could have taken it, I know. Why didn't you?" "Because I don't want the throne to prove a point." Silence. Then I added, "I want the table to outlast whoever sits at the head." My father stood up slowly, walked around the table, stopped in front of me. "How long have you been preparing for this?" "It wasn't preparation," I said. "It was patience." He studied me for several seconds, and then he said something he had never said in 29 years. You saw further than I did. It wasn't an apology, but for him, it was admission. Marcus remained CEO, but no longer untouchable. Major decisions now required broader approval. Transparency increased. Oversight committees formed. External investors responded positively. The market didn't punish us, it stabilized, because markets respect governance more than dominance. A week later, I met Hale at the same quiet cafe. I expected you to take the seat, he said. So did everyone else. Why didn't you? Because control isn't ownership. He smiled slightly. Your father never understood that. And now he might. I didn't become CEO, but I became impossible to ignore. Every major decision now had to account for me. Not because I demanded it, but because the structure required it. My father no longer looked at me as the soft son. He looked at me as balance. Marcus no longer treated me as competition. He began asking for my perspective before board sessions. The empire didn't change hands, but the way it operated changed permanently. I never took the throne. Because power isn't sitting at the head of the table. Power is ensuring no one owns the table alone. And that was the final vote.